Alchemy is a word that evokes a plethora of different mental images for most people. Dark, secret rooms, vials of strange concoctions, esoteric and occult books, and secret societies. Perhaps people have encountered alchemy through popular culture, such as the mention of Nicholas Flamel and the Philosopher's Stone in Harry Potter, the popular anime Full Metal Alchemist, or even the famous book called The Alchemist. But what is alchemy really? How has it been practiced? What is its history? Is it a dark, magical, superstitious practice as many assume, or does it have more of a basis in science? And what is its relationship with the more widely accepted field today of chemistry? These are all questions that we're going to be tackling today as we ask ourselves, what is alchemy? Another reminder that I've just released a new song called Tasting with my band Zini. It's an alternative rock song with influences from Middle Eastern instruments and melodies, so go check that out if you're interested, and leave me a comment and share it if you like it. Thank you so much. Alchemy is, of course, a topic with a long history, a history of many distinct phases. From its earliest origins in Hellenic Egypt, through the Arab and Islamic hit context, to the Golden Age of Alchemy in early modern Europe, and its contemporary developments. We will try to go through all these different phases and what was significant about each of them, perhaps with a bit of extra focus on Islamic hit alchemy, since this is more so within my field of expertise than other eras of the topic. But first of all, what is alchemy in a very basic sense? Some would perhaps say that it is a kind of precursor to modern chemistry, and there is a certain level of truth to that. Many of the methodologies of chemistry come from a shared background, and that's precisely the point, right? That this separation between alchemy and chemistry is something that has happened in the modern world, and earlier there was no such separation, right? So they have a shared past, and it's only recently that these distinctions between the two terms have been made. What this might perhaps tell us is that there is some overlap or similarity between the two, and this is certainly true. Alchemists were people who were working with material substances and elements to transform metals and other substances, to create a process of transmutation of metals, often specifically with the aim of creating gold. And this practice of trying to create gold is called chrysopoeia. In alchemy's later history, it was also often used to create medicines and elixirs for improving health or curing diseases. Another thing that might be good to bring up in the beginning is that there is a very common misconception about alchemy today. We often hear people saying that alchemy is actually not this physical practice that is maybe thought to be, but that it is really a spiritual or psychological process of transformation, and that these alchemical writings and symbols are just, well, they're just that. They're symbols and metaphors for a transformation of the self or the soul. This, to be very brief and simple about it, this is a modern invention. This is not supported by any of the historical accounts of alchemy, but is really a modern reinterpretation of alchemy, primarily associated with people like Carl Jung, like members of the Theosophical Society, and so on. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that historically, but this is good to keep in mind at first, that this is not how alchemy, for the most part, has worked historically. And we'll get back to this reinterpretation a bit later on in the video as well. Instead, we are here dealing with an art that has indeed primarily been physical and experimental, carried out by individuals working with real materials and with real physical aims. So, where does the story of alchemy begin? This is a hard question to answer, and the internal or emic perspective can of course differ from the academic historical one. But essentially, the earliest examples of alchemy can be dated to the first centuries of the first millennium AD, and primarily in Hellenic Egypt. That is, Egypt as it was ruled and influenced by Greek culture and language. This was an incredibly interesting and vibrant environment in different ways, and it is here that we see the development of some very significant traditions and movements. It is here that what we call Hermeticism or Hermetism appears. It is here that the earliest murmurings of Neoplatonism appears, Gnosticism, and, of course, alchemy. So it was born in this same intellectual environment, which is good to keep in mind. Specifically, the region in and around Alexandria was especially significant, because it is here that we get the first examples, the earliest examples of alchemy. Based on the earliest sources that we have, such as the writings of the Pseudo-Democritus in his work Physica Cae Mystica, Natural and Secret Things, it seems that this art was originally one that aimed at imitating nobler materials like gold, right? So they would try to make other metals look like gold or silver, not necessarily make them into actual gold. And they provide several recipes for how to do this, some of which actually work pretty well. But at some point, and the scholar Lawrence Principe points to the 3rd century, there was a shift to where the goal was instead to actually create gold, to turn otherwise base materials into gold, known by the aforementioned name chrysopoeia, and sometimes also into silver. The word that eventually came to be used for this art generally was chemia in Greek, and there is some different theories about what this word actually refers to or what it means. Some point to the Greek meaning of the word as being something like the art of alloying metals or pouring, or even something to cast together. Another theory is that the word might derive from the original native name for Egypt, Kemet. Thus that the art of chemia or chemia was somehow the quote-unquote Egyptian art, because it was associated with that region, or more literally it would be the black art, because Kemet means the black land essentially. Because, as we said, it is in Egypt that this practice really flourishes. And it's also here that we find the earliest known major figure of the alchemical tradition, a fascinating man called Zosimus of Panopolis. Zosimus was, as his name suggests, from the city of Panopolis, and it is from him that we get the earliest surviving alchemical writings, even though they are only fragments or a small section of a much wider corpus. In Zosimus, there is a clear goal of transmuting metals, and we get descriptions and techniques for accomplishing this that are quite detailed. It's also clear that by this time, a certain theoretical foundation for alchemical practice had started to develop, if only in quote-unquote primitive form. Zosimus seemed to view metals as being composed of 2 parts or principles: body, soma, and spirit, pneuma. In this view, the pneuma, or spirit, is the active principle and that which gives metal all their characteristics. The body, or soma, on the other hand, is simply a pure, attributeless material that isn't really anything at all without the influence of spirit, just like prime matter in the philosophy of Aristotle. Thus, the body of each metal is identical, whether it's gold or copper or whatever, and the spirit is that which contains and make these bodies into the specific metals. What this leads to, theoretically, is that if one can separate the pure spirit of a metal from its body, it can then be transformed. So for example, if you can isolate the spirit of gold from its body, then take another metal and isolate the pure receptive substance or body of that, then you can use the spirit of gold to transform that body, that metal, into gold. Make sense? In Lawrence Principe's words, quote, "Transmutation would be accomplished by reducing a metal to its common metallic matter and then introducing the qualities of the desired metal." Indeed, much of what this alchemy was based on was a certain view of the world, influenced partly by practical experience of glassmaking and other physical endeavors, but also Greek philosophical theories about the world, including writings by people like Aristotle, obviously. Among these theoretical cornerstones is the common idea of monism. In this case, meaning that all things, all substances, are essentially made up of one and the same thing. And if everything is made up of the same stuff, essentially, that seems to indicate that we can make anything into anything else, right? We saw this just now with the idea of isolating body from spirit and thus being able to make any metal into any other metal. This idea of monism within alchemy has come to be represented by the famous Ouroboros symbol, one consisting of a snake, or sometimes a dragon, eating its own tail. In one of the earliest surviving alchemical texts, the Chrysopoeia by Cleopatra the Alchemist, we find one of the most famous and earliest examples of the Ouroboros, accompanied by the Greek words hen to pan, the all is one, or the one is all. This would be a recurring theme and philosophical basis that we find essentially all across the history of alchemy in its different cultural guises. So by Zosimus' time and shortly after, there had developed an art of alchemy based on some of these theoretical foundations. By isolating the transforming substance that could turn any metal into precious gold, one could hopefully achieve the goal of Chrysopoeia. Zosimus seems to have called this sought-after substance the water of sulfur, but soon it was to be given a much more famous name:
the Philosopher's Stone.
These philosophical characteristics it of course shares with many of the other movements that appeared at around this time and in the same geographical location. For example, alchemy and the tradition of Hermetism are often strongly connected with each other. Especially in later tradition, the figure of Hermes Trismegistus often came to be seen as the very originator of esoteric knowledge, and in particular things like astrology and alchemy. He was the patron saint and sometimes even prophet of alchemy. And while the historical reality of Hermes is of course more than up for questioning, it is after all true that the environment that brought much of the Hermetica, the Hermetic literature, especially the philosophical Hermetica like Corpus Hermeticum, was the same environment that essentially gave birth to alchemy. So there is a kind of connection here, if only indirect. So this is the earliest development. Alchemy was born in Hellenic Egypt as a combination of the practical arts of smelting, glassmaking, and other things with the philosophical speculations and theories of the Greek philosophers. The goal of the first alchemists like Zosimus was Chrysopoeia, to create gold, specifically by being able to alchemically create
the Philosopher's Stone,
a pure substance that could turn any metal into gold. There had also developed a certain air of secrecy and esotericism around the art for various reasons. But it is, of course, with the development of alchemy into the Islamic context and with the Arabic-speaking scholars that alchemy arguably reaches its maturity. The Arabs, and when I say Arab here, I mean those scholars and writers, philosophers that wrote and spoke Arabic, not necessarily any kind of reference to an ethnicity or something like that, just putting that out there. They took great interest in this art and developed it even further into the form that we know it as today. Indeed, the very name alchemy is born in this context when the Arabs took the word chemia from Greek and added the Arabic definite article, al, in front of it, making it alchemia. The origins of alchemy in the Islamic world is a bit obscure, as most things are in that early period, but many sources point to the wider Shi'i movement as a breeding ground for this development. Shi'ism, or Shia Islam, was, especially in the early period, associated with things like esoteric and occult knowledge. To them, it was the Imams, the select descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, who succeeded him as religious and spiritual authorities, and it was they who possessed the true divine knowledge to properly interpret the Quran and its esoteric meanings. They were also thought to be the possessors of esoteric and occult knowledge more generally. In other words, Shi'ism has a kind of inherent, inbuilt esotericism. It's initiatory in the sense that only those who pledge allegiance to the Imam are given access to these teachings, but also because there is such an emphasis on such hidden, batin in Arabic, knowledge. Specific Imams like Ja'far as-Sadiq are known as great authorities and teachers of the esoteric and the occult. Perhaps naturally then, it might be in this Shi'i environment that alchemy first flourished in the Islamic world. Of course, this is a bit of a simplification. As the Arabs and Muslims spread across the Middle East and Mediterranean world, they quickly took an interest in the knowledge and cultures of the local people. A translation movement started where books in Greek and other languages would be translated into Arabic and studied by the Muslims. And alchemical texts seem to have been part of this transmission. There are even probably mythical stories about Khalid ibn Yazid, one of the early Umayyad princes, who supposedly gave up his royal position to travel to Egypt and learn alchemy there from Christian practitioners of the art. This is probably fictional, but it does point to the fact that Egypt seems to have still been very much associated with alchemy, even into the Islamic period. That was kind of the center for this activity, this art. But as I said, the earliest clear examples of alchemy seem to be connected, directly or indirectly, with different Shi'i groups. The early Ismailis seem to have dabbled in alchemy during their period of hiding in Syria, and these Ismailis in general would of course go on to adopt Neoplatonist and esoteric ideas, perhaps more than any other Islamic group. But there's also a connection here with the single most central and important figure in the history of Islamic alchemy, and perhaps in the history of alchemy in general. His name was Jabir ibn Hayyan, known later in Latin as Geber, and the writings attributed to him would completely transform and define much of the history of alchemy going forward. The problem with Jabir, though, is that the historical reality of this person is hotly debated and uncertain. There are a lot of writings attributed to Jabir in this period, so many that it's unlikely that they were written by a single person. Indeed, many scholars, both today and even back then, argue that Jabir never actually existed as a historical person. Instead, Jabir ibn Hayyan was simply a name used by a host of different alchemical writers in another example of the pseudonymity which was so common in this tradition. Even in the great Fihrist of Ibn Nadim from the 10th century, the author tells us that there are many who doubt the historical reality of Jabir even back then, even though he himself seems to disagree. He seems to think that there was a historical Jabir, but he points out that many others disagree. If we go by the idea that there was a historical Jabir ibn Hayyan, though, the classic story goes that he was born in Kufa in the middle of the 8th century, and that he was quite a brilliant scholar. He started studying alchemy with several different teachers, but the most important one is claimed to have been the aforementioned Ja'far as-Sadiq, the 6th Shi'i Imam who lived in Medina. This is the connection with Shi'ism that I was talking about before, connecting Jabir directly with the divine esoteric knowledge of the Imams. It's even claimed that Jabir was Ja'far's closest and most beloved student. Then, it is said, he went on to travel to Baghdad, where he became close with the Abbasid court of Harun al-Rashid. Again, this is all very uncertain and based on sources from much later that reconstruct the life of this character, but this is the classic story. Now, we might argue that there certainly could have been a historical Jabir ibn Hayyan, and certain aspects of this story might have some basis in reality, but almost assuredly, much of the writings attributed to him was written by others who referred back to the authority of his name. So when we talk about Jabir here, going forward in the video, we will be referring to the writings attributed to Jabir. So when I say Jabir wrote this or that, I mean it's written in the texts that are attributed to him, not necessarily that it was written by a historical person called Jabir. Okay, just footnote. And it is in these writings that we get the first formulations of the sulfur and mercury theory of the metals, which is what will become essentially the standard theoretical foundation for the art across history. Famously in works like the Kitab al-Adab, the Book of Clarification, Jabir argues that all metals are made up of sulfur and mercury in different configurations. Now, it should be pointed out that this is not the same as the substances mercury and sulfur that we talk about today. Rather, these names are used kind of metaphorically, you could say, for a general kind of substance or principle within metals. They knew about sulfur and mercury, and it's clear that they're not referring to those elements as we know them today, but it's referring to, again, these principles in metals that are active and passive, and which play off each other. This is probably taken from Aristotle's idea of the two exhalations from the center of the earth, one moist and one smoky, and the later writings of people like Pseudo-Bolinus, who argue that metals are made when these two exhalations condense underground in different configurations. It might, of course, also connect to Zosimus' theory of the body and spirit of each metal. It's kind of similar to this, as mercury and sulfur kind of function in the same way. Jabir writes, quote, "The metals are all of the substance of quicksilver, or mercury, coagulated with the mineral sulfur that rises into it as a smoky exhalation of the earth. They differ only in their accidental qualities, which depend upon the different forms of sulfur which enter into their composition. For their part, these sulfurs depend upon the different earths and their exposure to the heat of the sun. The most subtle, pure, and balanced sulfur is the sulfur of gold. This sulfur coagulates quicksilver, mercury, with itself in a complete and balanced manner. On account of this balance, gold withstands fire, remaining unchanged in it." In other words, just like in Zosimus and the other Greek writers, there is a passive principle, mercury, that can be purified. And if the right kind and amount of sulfur is introduced to it, it can be turned into any metal. And the best or most pure and subtle sulfur, as he says, is that of gold. But Jabir also develops more complex theories and practices regarding how to accomplish this transmutation, and these are directly connected with the classic Aristotelian theory of the elements. As most of us know, this system conceives of 4 natural elements: fire, earth, water, and wind. And each of these elements are also made up of different combinations of another 4 principles: hot, cold, wet, and dry. So for example, water is wet and cold, fire is hot and dry, and so on. And each of the materials in the world are also made up of these principles. So what Jabir does in his writings is to theorize that these principles aren't just some abstract idea, but can actually be isolated and created. Through things like heating, materials and metals can be reduced down to its simplest elements. And even the elements can then be reduced down to the 4 principles. In other words, we can actually isolate a substance that is pure coldness, pure wetness, for example. And because everything is made up of different combinations and configurations of these substances, the purified materials can then be used and combined in specific configurations to create transmuting sulfur, or transmuting substance. Because you have the raw materials, you can essentially create anything you like. And the most perfect and pure combination would result in an agent that can create gold. This purest substance is, of course, the aforementioned
Philosopher's Stone.
or what Jabir and the Islamic alchemist came to call al-iksir, or the elixir, sometimes also called the red sulfur, kibrit al-ahmar. These formulations and theories would of course go on to become incredibly popular, not just in the Islamic world, but in the wider world of alchemy globally and for the rest of history. Another very significant development during the Islamic period is the connection between the alchemical art and Hermes and Hermetism. In the early Islamic milieu, we see the appearance of new texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary sage of the Hermetica. And soon, Hermes had become associated not just with the biblical Enoch, but also with the Quranic prophet Idris, thus giving him a legitimate position within Islamic sacred history and teaching. Hermes/Idris was thought to have been raised to a lofty station, as the Quran says, taken up to the upper realms and taught esoteric secrets which he then relayed to the people. And in particular, it is during this period that Hermes becomes especially identified as the originator and master of alchemy in particular. Thus, many of the Hermetic texts that show up and were probably composed in Arabic have a direct connection with alchemy. Ibn Nadim writes in the Fihrist that the practitioners of the art of alchemy, which is the art of producing gold and silver from other materials, maintain that the first person to speak of the science of the alchemical art was the sage Hermes the Babylonian, who emigrated to Egypt when the people were dispersed from Babylonia and ruled over Egypt. He was both a wise sage and a philosopher. He initiated the art of alchemy and wrote numerous books on the subject. The most famous and influential of these books or texts is definitely the so-called Emerald Tablet. This short text was first found in a bigger text called the Book of the Secrets of Creation and the Craft of Nature by an author calling himself Balanus, which is an Arabic version of Apollonius. And the legend says that it was originally found on an emerald tablet held in the hands of a corpse in a crypt under a statue of Hermes, one of the juiciest stories I've ever heard in my entire life. But it's more likely composed in or around the 8th century, either originally in Arabic or possibly in Syriac and then translated into Arabic. In this text, the Emerald Tablet would go on to be cited by many alchemists across history. It's one of the foundational texts, really, of alchemy since then, and which also sort of connects it directly to Hermes and the Hermetic tradition in a direct way. It's a very short text and opens with the very famous words, as above, so below. In al-a'la min al-asfal, wal-asfal min al-a'la, which translates more literally to something like the above is from or of the below, and the below is from or of the above. So it's kind of the same, but in the original it could be interpreted maybe a bit different ways. This, as understood by most of the tradition, is a key concept in alchemy and Hermeticism, that there is a macrocosm, the universe at large, that corresponds entirely with the microcosm, which is the human being. Another interpretation is that the macrocosm is the celestial world and the microcosm is the terrestrial world. This is a more shallow interpretation perhaps, but it seems also very likely to have been part of what is being said here. The celestial and terrestrial are connected and mirror each other. Regardless, this microcosm-macrocosm concept or idea would be very important going forward in alchemy, but also would be picked up by a lot of mystical traditions in Islamic mysticism and beyond as well. So just for that, the Emerald Tablet is very important, very influential. The text also seemed to contain hints of that important teaching of monism that we saw was foundational to alchemy from the beginning, especially when it says all things were from one. كانت الأشياء كلها من واحد. And all this probably also affected the Jabirian corpus very directly. Indeed, many Islamic scholars and thinkers would follow and expand upon the Jabirian ideas with different aims and perspectives. Indeed, as Principe points out in his excellent book called The Secrets of Alchemy, since the categories of alchemy and chemistry were only separated in the modern period, in earlier ones it was seen as one and the same thing, and could even extend beyond the goal of transmuting metals per se. This pre-separation phase, when the two were one and the same thing, he chooses to denote by spelling the word as chemistry instead. And those just listening to the podcast, this is spelled so CHYMISTRY, so chemistry versus chemistry with an E, to sort of denote a phase before the separation of alchemy and chemistry, when the two were essentially the same thing. Thus including both aspects, both the purely alchemical goal of transmuting metals, but also other experiments with natural substances more generally. And this broader perspective can be seen very clearly in a major Islamic alchemist like Abu Bakr Ar-Rāzī. He is a really fascinating philosopher and scientist from the 10th century who stands out among all his peers for various reasons. Among them, he is said to have been openly critical of Islam and religion, questioning the authority of the Quran and prophecy, although some sources claim otherwise, and maybe the sources that quote these very extreme positions and says things that he's supposed to have said about the Quran and religion could be later sources just trying to defame him, basically. But he probably got this reputation for a reason, at least. So he's very interesting ideas and very fascinating in many different ways. Two of his most famous works are the Kitab al-Asrar, the Book of Secrets, and the even more famous Kitab Sir al-Asrar, the Book of the Secret of Secrets, where he presents detailed descriptions of chemical/alchemical operations. Al-Rāzī is significant for a variety of reasons. In a sense, he is often seen as being responsible for giving alchemy a more scientific outlook, let's say, basing himself solely on empirical investigation. His books describe various techniques that he innovated, such as distillation and sublimation. He classified substances into categories that became very influential. He also seems to have innovated in terms of the material, giving some of the first examples of chemical equipment that is still in use today. But he's also said to be the one who classified material things in the world into these three forms that we still use today, which is solid, liquid, and gas. Like, for example, we teach about water or H2O, right? It can be water, it can be liquid form, it can be gas form, as in water vapors, and it can be solid, like in ice. And this is like, it works for basically all things in the world. So this seems to come from Al-Rāzī as well. It's worth pointing out here again that Al-Rāzī's use of alchemia isn't limited to chrysopoeia or transmutation. Indeed, these themes are relatively absent from his writings. Now, for sure, he was interested in and involved with it, but his definition of alchemy was broader, dealing with what Principe calls anything that we could today broadly call chemical. In general, alchemy became an important part of the wider sciences in the Islamic world, sometimes considered under the category of ulum al-khafiyya, or the occult sciences, but essentially seen as a form of natural science. Thus, we see it both in more occult books like the Ghayat al-Hakim, known in Latin as the Picatrix, perhaps the most famous book of astral magic in the history of the world, written in Islamic Andalusia, but also in more quote-unquote sober books of science and philosophy, such as with Al-Rāzī or the Ikhwan al-Safa. Now, there is another very famous Arab alchemist that had a very unique perspective and would be very influential in later developments too, and his name was Muhammad ibn Umayl at-Tamimi. He might have been from Andalusia originally, as one of his nisbahs is al-Andalusi, but it seems that he was mainly active in Egypt, and he also wrote some very influential works on alchemy. In a sense, we could argue that Ibn Umayl represents the opposite approach compared with Rāzī. If the latter was primarily an empiricist when it came to alchemical practice, Ibn Umayl's approach is perhaps more mystical. Scholars argue that Ibn Umayl was probably an Ismaili, belonging to that especially esoteric branch of Shi'ism, which at this point shouldn't be all that surprising to anyone, but his most famous work is probably the Kitab Al-Rūmūz, or the Book of the Explanation of Symbols, where he sets out to explain the symbolic language that the alchemical sages use and what those symbols actually mean on a mystical and spiritual level. He didn't deny the reality of physical alchemy, but his aim with the work was primarily to provide a key for the mystical understanding and reading of alchemical text and their esoteric language. Ibn Umayl would also go on to be famous in later European alchemy and also had a great influence on the symbolic language of Islamic mysticism. What's unique about Ibn Umayl, as we saw, is that he seems to see alchemy or view it as maybe primarily symbolic. Of course, he recognized the physical aspect of alchemy too, but his main focus is on the more mystical, let's say call it spiritual, interpretations of alchemy and how to read alchemical text in that way. So in this, he seems to have conceived of alchemy as a much more broader thing, and we see this also in other Islamic writers, especially with some of the Islamic mystics, that alchemy is a physical art of transmuting metals, but it's also a wider metaphysical thing. The whole world is seen as a kind of alchemical process, God's alchemical lab, and there are the mystical and spiritual aspects of alchemy that the mystics, for example, are engaged in. Now, we mentioned in the beginning that it is quite common today to view alchemy as actually just being a spiritual art, that real alchemy is actually the transformation of the soul or the psyche rather than physical transmutation. But as we also mentioned, this is mostly a modern invention without any basis in historical reality. Now, with that said, however, someone like Ibn Umayl does represent a tendency that does lean in that direction historically, right? Showing that while the idea as an overarching interpretation of alchemy fully is a modern invention, the very idea of alchemy having to do with something more than just physical experiments has historic precedence, in Islam at least, as it could be seen as both physical and spiritual. Furthermore, it is true and worth pointing out that alchemical language and symbolism has indeed been used in the context of spiritual practice and transformation. This is very clear in the tradition of Sufism, for example, which is what is often referred to as Islamic mysticism. Here, alchemical language of the purification of metals is used as a metaphor for the purification of the heart or soul, the eradication of egoic qualities, and the annihilation in God. It is true that some of the Sufis were said to be alchemists. One of the most famous early examples is Dhul-Nun al-Misri, an early Sufi who is said to have formulated some of the key concepts about divine knowledge in the tradition. Perhaps not surprisingly, he was from Egypt and is said to have been involved in alchemy in some way. We find this in different sources, including the Fihrist of Ibn Nadim, where Dhul-Nun is actually listed under the category of the alchemists in that book. So it's a catalog of different people from different traditions, and Dhul-Nun is actually in the category of the alchemists, where he refers to as the practitioners of the art, rather than being in the section about Sufism or mystics, which is quite interesting, right? But for most of the history of Sufism, it's really the language and symbolism of alchemy that is used, rather than Sufis being actual alchemical practitioners. The transformation of the soul from its egoic state to one of oneness and purity was an alchemical process. Thus, the famous Abu Hamid al-Ghazali wrote a book on Sufi ethics and self-transformation called The Alchemy of Happiness, Kimiyya is-Sa'adat, playing on that association. Furthermore, the great Sufi master Ibn Arabi dedicates chapter 167 of his masterpiece Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyya, the Meccan Revelations, to alchemy in a sense, calling the chapter, probably in direct reference to Ghazali, Fi Ma'arifat Kimiyya al-Sa'ada, on knowledge of the alchemy of happiness. Here, he gives a general view of alchemy, seemingly saying that alchemy has several levels, both the physical but also spiritual and divine. But the chapter is really dedicated to the transformation of the soul and its journey towards perfection, just like metals are transmuted into perfection in gold. He says in the introduction that, quote, "We have brought this up so as to explain to you how spiritual wisdom is connected to what is called the alchemy of the two ways. But why is it called the alchemy of true happiness? Because happiness inevitably lies within it, and in addition, according to some of the people of God, there is nothing better than it. For it brings you to the degree of complete perfection which belongs to the real human male. Not everyone who has found happiness is accorded perfection, for while all who are perfect are happy, not every happy one is perfect. Perfection means reaching and joining with the highest degree, and that is assuming the likeness of the source. So do not imagine that when the prophet said that there have been many men who attained perfection, he meant the sort of perfection that ordinary people talk about. Rather, it is what we have mentioned here, and this is as much as can be given to the knowing aptitude in this low world. To reach perfection, or be transmuted into gold, is to reach the true human perfection of oneness and of becoming the so-called insan al-kamil, the complete human being. The concept of
The philosopher's stone,
here often called the red sulfur, al-kibrit al-ahmar, and simply al-iksir, the elixir, is something, perhaps a spiritual inspiration or grace that, according to Ibn Arabi, exists in each and everything and which can transform anyone to spiritual perfection. This concept of the red sulfur is quite recurring and central to Ibn Arabi, and we find it, among other places, in one of his poems, written in the Andalusian Zajal style. He says, quote, "You who are seeking ascesis, be sparing with your life. Look at the elixir in your attributes, and you will find that from your essence it flows to your essence. In fourfold composition as is your existence. Your red sulfur is known, although truly it is the greatest non-existent, though hidden, apparent to the eye, coded but understood. And now, close to you, its secrets appear throughout the foundations of what is new in you." And we could go on talking about these conceptions of alchemy and Islamic mysticism, but you get the idea. Mystics like Ibn Arabi had a broader view of alchemy in a sense, and used the language of the physical transmutation of metals symbolically to talk about the purification of the human heart and soul on its journey to God. But this, of course, does not give credence to the idea that alchemy was only always just a metaphor for these spiritual practices. This is not the case, but it is true that many have used the language of alchemists, like the Sufis here, to talk about inner transformation. So they had a broader understanding of alchemy, but it was one that included, perhaps as the most obvious part, the actual physical experimentation of substances, metals. But not everyone were fans of alchemy, or perhaps more specifically of Chrysopeia. An example of a critic is perhaps the greatest Islamic philosopher in history, Ibn Sina. He was, of course, also a great physician and would have been involved in chemical / chemical with a Y work generally, but in his masterpiece Kitab al-Shifa, the Book of the Healing, he's openly critical of chrysopoeia and the reality of metallic transmutation. He says, quote, "As to the claims of the alchemists, it must be clearly understood that it is not in their power to bring about any true change of species." But it was through his deep knowledge of and involvement with chemistry and alchemy more generally that gave him the authority to even say such a thing. He studied minerals, metals, and other substances as a physician, but he simply denied the reality of transmuting metals. This, of course, had an effect on many, but it didn't mean that the art died down in the Islamic world at all. Instead, it continued to flourish with later important figures like Izz-ad-Din al-Jildaki and others. And just like with so many other sciences, it was this flourishing of knowledge and experimentation in the Islamic world that was eventually spread and handed over to Europe in the later Middle Ages, and would lead to another golden era of alchemical activity during the Renaissance and early modern periods. Here, it was picked up as enthusiastically, if not even more so, than it had been in the Islamic world. And you can imagine why. How come alchemy has been so popular in general? Well, the prospect of being able to create gold is a quite alluring one, right? It means you have access to an essentially unlimited amount of riches, which would be very politically, if anything, useful, right? So this was something that a lot of people were very much interested in on a physical worldly level. But we also saw in the Islamic world that it was also seen as broader than that alchemy could also be something spiritual, something religious, and even divine in some respects. And in this vein, we see similar ideas in the European context as well, with figures like Roger Bacon, the English polymath and Franciscan friar who came to the defense of alchemy. He not only gives alchemical recipes in his attributed writings, but also argues that alchemy is a means of strengthening Christendom and even our faith and spirituality in relation to Christianity. Alchemy, to him, was a divine science. Transformation of substance and matter was part of God's natural order, and when we study that divine order and can even improve on it to some degree, according to him, that deepens our relationship with the divine. It might be surprising to some of you to know that a devout, religious Franciscan friar, like a religious official in that sense, not official, but a very deeply religious monk would be interested in something like alchemy. But this is actually a good example to show and point out some of the preconceived notions that we have. Because indeed, for this period, especially the Middle Ages, the majority of the alchemical texts and activities that we find are by people within religious institutions, especially Franciscans for some reason, so friars of the Franciscan order. Because alchemy was something that was widely interesting, not just to some, fringe esoteric occult people, but to kings, to regular people, to religious people, even to the church itself. A lot of the popes were interested in and maybe even active in alchemy, although some of them were also critical of it. But you get my idea, right? That this was something that was widely accepted gradually, and not by everyone, of course, but it was not some secret thing just done in caves or in secret laboratories. It was very much out in the open and something that a lot of people were engaged in, including religious institutions and the church. And if the art was controversial, which it also was sometimes, it wasn't because it was heretical or some kind of sorcery, but because it was either seen as simply not working, like Ibn Sina said, or that its practitioners were frauds and were scamming people. In fact, another example of an influential alchemist from the medieval period is another Franciscan, John of Rupicissa. He was a French alchemist in the 14th century that not only joined the Franciscans, but also the particular group called the Spirituals, who were an intense gang that wanted to reform the order, but also held very strong eschatological views that the Antichrist was coming very soon. John seems to have espoused these teachings and caused a bit of a ruckus to the point that he was jailed by the church. But it is while in jail that he writes most of his famous and influential alchemical works. In them, he follows the general sulfur and mercury theory inherited from Jabir, seeking to create
the philosopher's stone.
He furthermore continued in a similar line to Bacon in the way that he connects alchemy to the needs of Christendom and even directly with Christian theology. His alchemy was directly connected to his eschatological teachings. Because the Antichrist was coming soon, the church would need all the help it could get, including help from alchemy to create gold for economic reasons. He writes, quote, I consider the coming times predicted by Christ in the Gospels, namely, of the tribulations in the time of the Antichrist, under which the Roman Church shall be tormented and have all her worldly riches despoiled by tyrants. Thus, for the sake of liberating the chosen people of God, to whom it is granted to know the ministry of God and the magisterium of truth, I wish to speak of the work of the great philosopher's stone without lofty speech. My intention is to be helpful to the good of the Holy Roman Church and briefly to explain the whole truth about the stone. He also sanctifies the art of alchemy by connecting it with Christian theology in a symbolic sense, an idea that he might be getting from an earlier alchemist referred to as Arnaldo Villanova. In this, he or they connect Mercury with Christ, and just like Christ suffers on the cross, Mercury must suffer, quote-unquote, through the alchemical process, but through that process also be elevated and purified, just like Christ in the resurrection. Principe explains it like this, quote, Thus, the reference to Christ's elevation on the cross signifies a chemical process of volatilization in which the prepared mercury is raised up by means of heat from the bottom of the flask into the heat of the alembic, the higher part of the heating vessel, where the purified material condenses as crystalline sublimate. The Son of Man must ascend from the earth into the air and ascend upon the cross of the alembic like a crystal. There's of course a lot more detail to this comparison, but it shows you the very interesting ways that John and perhaps others before him that influenced him connected this alchemical process directly with Christian theology and symbolism, thus giving it much more of a sacred nature, you can say, through that connection. But John is very significant for another development as well. With the coming of the Antichrist, the Christians would of course need riches and gold to survive the battle, but they would also need their health. And so he used alchemy, or chemistry, to try to create a substance or substances that could heal or even prolong life. He was able to, for example, distill alcohol from wine in this process, calling this, the alcohol, water of life, or aqua vitae, and as the quintessence, all words that are still used widely today. But this marks an important point in the history of alchemy when the creation of medicines became a second main goal of the alchemist alongside chrysopoeia. Of course, we had seen certain examples of this earlier, such as in Al-Rāzī, but John might be the first to chemically create claimed medicines, and by using alcohol, which he had realized had great preserving compounds and the ability to bring out, the healing properties of plants and other things much better than other things like water. Like alcohol is very good at bringing out some of these healing properties and things, which is something that he seems to have discovered. It becomes clear in his writings. Might also be worth mentioning another figure from this later medieval/early Renaissance period, who is of course Nicholas Flamel. Now Flamel is very known around the world. He's a sort of symbol of alchemy to a lot of people. Much of that fame stems from him being mentioned in the Harry Potter series as a person that supposedly did succeed in creating the Philosopher's Stone, and through that stone also being immortal. Like he prolonged his life indefinitely. But there's a lot of misunderstandings when it comes to Nicholas Flamel. First of all, he was indeed a historical person. He was from France. You can visit his grave and his house, his claimed grave. And he lived probably between the 14th to 15th century. We don't know that much about him as far as I know. He might have been a seller of books somehow. But really everything that he came to represent, all the sort of claims about him, really comes much later, like 200 years after he lived in the 17th century, when he becomes a symbol for alchemists. And here it is claimed that he is one of the people, or he may be the person, I don't know, who succeeded in creating the Philosopher's Stone. And that he also, together with his wife, managed to create an elixir of life that prolonged their life. And because of that, there are many claimed sightings of Flamel, across history, much later than he would have probably passed away, right? So like 200 years after he lived, people were claiming to see Nicholas Flamel. So he was claimed to be immortal because of him having discovered this substance. The problem is, it's not a problem, but so the misunderstanding in Harry Potter, for example, is that the stone is the thing that's supposed to give immortal life, which is not the case. The stone is just this substance for transmuting metals into gold. It's really this other thing that he's supposed to have done to create this elixir of life that gave him that immortality. But anyway, this is probably the roots of this confusion that we still find today. But Flamel, he's a very interesting figure. I'm not going to spend that much more time talking about him. He's an important symbol historically, clearly, and is very well known today, so I wouldn't have been doing my job properly if I didn't at least mention him. But we're going to move on from him for now, and we might be able to return to him for a dedicated episode or something. We'll see. In any case, alchemy had grown into a major field of interest and practice in Europe by the early modern period. The inherited writings and ideas from the Arab Islamic writers had expanded upon and adjusted to its new cultural context. The basics remained, a huge interest in chrysopoeia and the transmutation of base metals into gold, particularly by being able to create the sought-after
Philosopher's Stone.
But with the works of people like John of Rupescissa and others, alchemy had come to be increasingly concerned with the preparation of medicines through chemical means. And this would come to play a major role as alchemy entered what is arguably its golden age in the early modern period, from the 16th to around the 18th century or so. Because it is here that we get one of the most fascinating figures in European intellectual history, and possibly the one with the best name of all time, Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, known more widely as Paracelsus. He came on the scene to completely turn the world of medicine upside down, even if his influence was primarily felt after his death. He essentially completely rejected the tradition of medicine that stretched back to Ibn Sina and Galen. It's even claimed that he publicly burned the writings of Ibn Sina, which is a very clear statement in that regard. Instead, he opted to use other techniques, using local German plants, for example, and emphasized the importance of employing chemistry as part of the job of a physician. As such, he also played an important role in the history of alchemy, as he is credited with being the one to add a third central ingredient alongside mercury and sulfur, namely salt, which indeed has powerful effects on the process. Paracelsus and his medical revolution is an important stepping stone in the process leading up to modern-day medicine, even if he's perhaps mostly a symbol for that change, more than that his actual particular ideas have been adopted. But still, he's very important in name and in symbol, and in practice to some degree, for the change of medicine from the sort of Galenic Avicennan practice to what we use today. This golden age, quote-unquote, of alchemy from around the 16th to the early 18th centuries saw its flourishing and huge popularity. There appeared an alchemical industry. Recipes by people claiming to have figured out the secrets to the Philosopher's Stone were sold and spread around, and practitioners searched in old books for hidden messages that might unlock the right combinations of elements and so on. Alchemists were hired by kings to make them rich, and medicines were created through chemical means. It's in this period that we naturally find some of the most famous alchemists, Robert Boyle, John Dee, and even Isaac Newton, who, aside from his great discoveries in physics, was, as many know, a devoted alchemist as well. It's also in this period that we get the most manuscripts and books about alchemy being published, and of course where we get most of the beautiful illuminated manuscripts and illustrations of alchemical practices and symbolic representations of this chemical process, many of which have become very famous today. These images that we see, often taken out of their actual context in the text, but still, they're very beautiful and fascinating to look at, as I'm sure you agree. But of course, alchemy also had its critics and was certainly a controversial practice in some circles, even back in its heyday. We saw that there had basically always been critics of Chrysopoeia. Ibn Sina, back in the 11th century, argued that transmutation of metals is impossible, and many of his successors in Europe followed suit. For example, Thomas Aquinas had a similar opinion, granting that some alchemists might create substances that look like gold, but could never actually create true gold. This also led to the quite common view of alchemists as fraudsters, essentially. Many claimed to have the recipe to make gold, or made a big fuzz about showing how they made gold in order to get sponsored by powerful people, for example, but were then later proved to have faked the whole thing. So alchemists came to have this negative association in some circles. Even though many were genuinely passionate about the art, there were certainly those who did it only for fame and gain, and this affected the reputation of the art as a whole. And it is strange how quickly alchemy lost favor in the 18th century. It went straight from its golden age to a dramatic decline in popularity in basically just a few decades, so that by the 1740s, it had lost almost all its credibility. Principe points out that the reasons for this are still debated by scholars, but the one obvious reason is probably the simple fact that new findings in science had shown that Chrysopoeia was indeed simply impossible, which is what we know to be true still today, right? It's based on theoretical, physical ideas about physics from Aristotle and so on that we know today are simply false. And so the whole enterprise kind of falls apart because it's built on a faulty understanding of how nature works. And so when that was realized in the 18th century, that probably was a very quick, there was a quick decline in popularity because of that. But as we've seen, there was more to alchemy than just Chrysopoeia, and many of those other goals, such as creating medicine, weren't looked at as negatively. And this is why we see in that 18th century the gradual separation of the categories of alchemy and chemistry, which had previously been seen as basically synonymous. Everything that was considered irrational or foolish, like Chrysopoeia, fell under alchemy, whereas the more useful and noble ventures like medicine was instead deemed chemistry, dropping that Arabic definite article, perhaps symbolically to distance themselves from that Arabic legacy, which was very much associated with Chrysopoeia and those kinds of practices in particular. And this is the situation that we still find today. Alchemy is something that falls under occultism or esotericism, whereas chemistry is firmly part of science. But it's also this division and development, the discovery of the impossibility of transmutation as traditionally understood, that led some to reinterpret the very nature of alchemy itself. This happens primarily from the mid-19th century, with figures like Mary and Atwood, who argue that all the alchemical descriptions that we find in the classical texts are actually not dealing with physical experiments at all, but is only a veiled language to talk about self-transmutation. This was also then picked up by the Theosophical Society through people like William Wynne Westcott, and became very popular in the wider field of Western esotericism and occultism. Principe writes, quote, "The view of alchemy as a self-transformative, meditative, or psychic process operating on the alchemist himself originated in the 19th century, but still has wide currency. Esotericists around the world have continued to develop these notions to the present day. Features of the Victorian spiritual/occultist interpretation often remain the default understanding of alchemy as a whole. The notions of a self-transformative or psychic alchemy obviously have inherent interest and importance as part of the long history of alchemy. However, the historical claims they make concerning the activities of alchemists of earlier eras are not valid, and so must be set aside if we wish to have an accurate understanding of alchemy during its golden age and before." But the most famous and influential of these reinterpreters of alchemy is undoubtedly Carl Jung. For him, alchemy was and had been primarily an art of transforming the psyche, and this became an important part of his wider thought. Subsequently, this idea, because of the popularity of Jung, this understanding of alchemy has become adopted by many people worldwide. And as Principe pointed out in the quotes that I just read, for many, this is kind of the standard view of alchemy, still today, right? And when we saw some examples of this kind of spiritual inner interpretations of alchemy in history, like in Ibn Umayl and the Sufis, for example, this is mostly an inaccurate reading of what alchemy has been historically. And that's basically where we find ourselves today. We are in a place where a lot of people have a skewed idea of what alchemy is or was. Either it's viewed as some kind of esoteric, dark occult practice performed only in secret in some dark laboratory by sketchy people, or it's seen as some kind of metaphor for a spiritual or psychological transformation, neither of which really captures the historical reality of the topic. For sure, alchemy has always had an air of secrecy and esotericism around it. The language used in alchemical writings are often consciously obscure and hidden behind dechnamen or hidden words. But at the same time, we've also seen that it has also mostly been simply another branch of natural science, a rational and accepted practice widely known to society and sometimes sponsored by kings and religious institutions. The distinction between alchemy and chemistry is a modern one, arguably one that does point to real distinctions in a sense today, whereas in history, though, the techniques that we would associate with both categories were seen as part of one and the same field or art. In this way, alchemy can serve as a good example to show us the many preconceived notions we have about many areas of history, including the relationship between religion and science, which is clearly not as black and white as we are often led to believe, or the great diversity and complexity within a single cultural or religious context where different people can have diametrically opposite views on topic by justifying it on the exact same sources. And how not just religions, but also things like alchemy always change and adapt with time and place and to new cultural contexts, so that alchemy today obviously is very different from alchemy the way it was 300 years ago, which in itself is very different from how alchemy was 300 years prior to that. It's always changing and adapting to new cultural contexts. Understanding the history of alchemy is thus also to better understand history in general and just the way that human society and relationships work. Thank you so much for listening and watching to this episode. Part of this year's Shocktober or spooky season content, but also kind of pointing out maybe that it isn't as spooky as many people think it is. I was considering whether I should do this episode under that Shocktober thing because I don't want to give more fuel to the idea that alchemy is this esoteric occult thing. But I think, because it has that cultural association, I use this opportunity to maybe argue against that idea through this episode, at least partly. So I hope you enjoy that. I would like to thank all my patrons who support this channel monetarily. I'm deeply grateful and thankful as always. If anyone else wants to become patrons, I will leave links to that in the description, and you can support my goal of giving free educational content on the world's religious, philosophical, and mystical traditions, historically and today. You can find me on my socials, on Instagram and TikTok and so on. It's on the screen. You can also follow my other channel, Filip Holm, where you find my music, including my new song, Tasting, which came out very recently. So you check that out there, or on Spotify, or wherever you like your music. There's a link tree in my description where you can find all my links that are of relevance. So check that out. If you're celebrating Halloween, then I wish you a happy Halloween. If you're celebrating Samhain, then I hope your Samhain is meaningful. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching and listening. Happy Halloween, and I'll see you in the next video.